I worked New Year's Eve at a historic hotel because I needed the money. That sentence sounds simple when I say it now, but at the time it was everything. Rent overdue, car on its last winter breath, a sister who kept texting, "Are you sure this is safe?" The job posting landed in my inbox on December 10th, private night manager, compensation negotiable. The sender was an address that looked corporate but gave nothing else away. The pay was absurd for one night, more than I'd earned in the previous 3 months combined. The contract was shorter than a paragraph and 3 pages long when they attached the terms: confidentiality, restricted communications, and one line in bold that I didn't fully parse until later: rules change after midnight. I told myself it was just a shift. One night at the Hawthorne House, a Victorian pile of dark stone and carved wood 2 towns over from where I lived. It was a place you'd expect to see on a postcard: brass lamps, a sweeping stair, carpets patterned like old maps. The owner's note said the hotel would be closed to the public for a private conservation project. They needed someone to stay overnight to monitor the property and maintain the mechanical systems, and they would require the manager to remain on site between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. No visitors, no unapproved phones. A company-issued satellite handset would be provided in case of emergency. I signed because I had to sign. I printed the contract, initialed the clauses with a pen that left a thin smear of my thumb, and I packed a duffel with both practical and comfort items: a headlamp, a spare phone battery, a cheap Canon DSLR, a notebook with a taped-on checklist, an extra sweater that smelled faintly like my sister's laundry, and a small hard drive with a folder labeled "Backup." The email subject line still haunts me: private night manager, competitive compensation. The acceptance confirmation was a single sentence: arrival at 6 p.m. on December 31st. Departure after morning inspection by 8 a.m. January 1st. I printed that too and stapled it beside the contract. I should describe the drive. It's important to keep the ordinary details because the whole thing hides inside normality. The road to Hawthorne House runs narrow and then narrower, hedges pressing close enough to catch your side mirror. The GPS tumbles between highways and small streets. The signal shudders like a stubborn eye. As I turned into the long approach, the hotel rose through a snowfall that felt like sugar. Its windows were dark, reflecting the road like old glass. There was a service entrance to the side and a locked main gate with a heavy chain. I had been given a key code that worked on the keypad and a handwritten number scribbled on the inside of the cover letter: 0912. The side door swung open without protest. Inside, the place smelled like lemon oil and paper. Everything was too clean, as if someone had paused life and taken a photograph of it.
The dining room had plates stacked under cloths. The bar had glasses lined like teeth. The front desk was a hulking oak thing with a carved lion on the corner. A brass placard announced the building's founding year in a script that curved the way old hands curve. There was an old clock on the wall with Roman numerals. It struck 6 as I set my bag down. First details that later mattered. The thermostat seemed set to an even 68. The generator in the basement had a sticker with its maintenance schedule and the model number: Kohler 20RZ200, last serviced August 19th. The satellite phone they'd given me was a small gray rectangle in a drawer labeled "Emergency Only." There was a binder marked "Staff, Night Duties" that contained a checklist: rounds at the boiler, check cistern levels, log temperatures every hour, check the exterior doors, check the guest registers. The guest registers were filthy with dust. I flipped through entries going back decades: names, dates, compliments about the lobster, an entry from March 1987 in an elegant hand. They had stapled a printed letter on top of the binder. "Welcome," it read. "Please honor the house rules. Respect the boundary. Call the number only in absolute emergency." There was a signature block with a name I learned later: William Blackwell. The first hours were quiet in a way I had never experienced. Not just the absence of laughter, but an active hush. The radiators hummed like caged insects. The brass fixtures seemed to swallow sound. Animals, I noticed at the edge of the drive, were also absent. No foxes, no rabbits. There had been a single crow that waited on the fence and then moved away when I blinked. At dusk, the entire tree line felt like a held breath. Around 9, I took a walk of the grounds because it was both my job and a way to kill time. I walked past the greenhouse and found small sets of carved marks on the undersides of hedges, thin, filed lines in the bark in repeating patterns that looked like rings or clock faces. The pattern kept repeating on the other side of the property, on a beam of the servants' quarters, on the underside of a stone bench, on the back of a carved chair left near the service entrance. I photographed them with the Canon. The camera timestamps were plain, 12/31/2022, 21:17, and my fingers felt numb from cold as I zoomed the lens. The marks were shallow but precise, like someone had used a file. I took notes in the notebook and then, on a reflex, added the time. That first night stretched oddly. I made tea in a chipped mug from behind the bar, coffee machine labeled Breville Model BES 870XL, watched steam curl away, and checked the camera footage from the security package. Nothing out of the ordinary, static than the occasional deer frame. When I sat to fill out the hourly log, I realized the battery on my backup phone had dropped from 80% to 14 in a way that didn't make sense. I had used it for 30 minutes at most.
I chalked it up to cold and bad batteries. The satellite phone was in its box, and I promised myself I'd only use it if the generator failed. Sometime in the small hours, between logging the boiler pressure and checking the cellar door, I found myself staring at a photograph tucked inside the guest ledger, a yellowed black and white of a man standing on the steps of Hawthorne House, face easy in the camera's flat light. I did a stupid thing and held it next to the mirror. The features were ordinary: wide nose, close-set eyes, hair parted on one side, but there was an ache of recognition I couldn't place. Later, after I'd found those same eyes and that same mouth in archived papers, I would think of that ache as the hotel remembering the faces it liked. For now, it was only the echo of the man's manner, which I dismissed and slid back into the book. I woke with sun that rose like pale paper through the drapes. It would have been my job to leave by 8, but I stayed until 9, wandering the long hallways, marking pages in the binder with coffee-stained fingers. The first hint from outside the hotel came in the form of a single call to the service line. The voice on the other end was a woman on the other side of town, and she said one sentence: "You should not be there at night." Her accent was soft, or the line made it soft. I wrote down her name, Marjorie. She worked at the town library. She laughed when I asked if she was joking. "Not funny," she said. "If you have any sense, you leave before midnight." Then the line went dead. At the time, I made a note to check the library later. I thought it was superstition. My brain, used to small-town warnings and overblown local myths, labeled the call as a relic. Still, it landed, a pebble into the water whose ripples I would later see. Insert the one soft request I made then, because people asked after. If you like these true-style horror reconstructions, consider subscribing. People in the town were odd in the way towns are odd to strangers. When I stopped into a diner to ask about a part for the boiler, the owner, a man with flour on his knuckles, slid a coffee toward me as if he had been expecting me for years. He called me by name without knowing my name. "You got a habit of buying the same batteries every Thursday, don't you?" he asked. And I blinked because I'd done something ridiculous and petty that week, bought bulk batteries, not something a stranger could know. He shrugged like it was nothing. Old houses have their ways, you'll see. The line between remembering and presumption blurred. His friendliness felt like a script he'd read before. The research part of the night and afternoon came from 3 things: the library with its air of dust and pine-scented polish, a stack of newspaper clippings bound in twine in an archive room, and a note tucked into the back of a civic ledger. A thin card from William Blackwell with an address and the words, "Remember the boundary."
At the library, Marjorie, a woman with hair pulled into a bun and nails that suggested long hours filing, led me to the archive as if she'd already rehearsed the walk. She pushed open a heavy metal door and switched on a light that hummed. The town records were a map of absences, clippings that listed missing caretakers, minor reports that had been folded and forgotten. I photographed them. The timestamps on my camera showed the hours piling up: 12/29/1994, 1/2/2001, 1/3/2008, 1/1/2015. Each was a thin report about a man or woman who'd been registered as the caretaker, who'd stayed the night, and who had not been seen after New Year's. One clipping, grainy and lifted from a paper that had been poor quality even then, had a photo of a group standing on the same steps of the Hawthorne House. The caption read, "Cadet-Style Celebration, 1952. I zoomed in, and my pulse started the first audible movement of the night. One face in the crowd looked like me. Not like me in the general sense of human features, but like an old photograph of me that had been left out in the sun. The shape of the jaw, the scar on the left brow, a dent I have from falling off a roof when I was 19, the same particular tilt of the eyes. It felt impossibly specific until I saw more. Clippings with faces across decades that repeated the same template, the same man or similar men reappearing across the years. At first, I thought it was a family that had been associated with the hotel for generations. Then the dates aligned, and the coincidence stopped feeling random. Each face was attached to a story of a caretaker who had disappeared around New Year's. The pattern looked like a clock marking time by absence. Marjorie handed me a bound notebook with brittle string. On the first page, a name: W. Blackwell, Portfolio Manager. The handwriting was tight and deliberate. The entries were everyday at first: notes on coal deliveries, a list of vendors, a comment about ice on the carriageway. Halfway through, the tone changed. The entries grew shorter, the letters slanted, and in the margins some passages were underlined until the ink bled. A line read in tiny, precise script: "The boundary is literal. It has teeth. We maintain it. It maintains us." Later pages mentioned a replacement procedure in the abstract. "The transfer works best when the event aligns," and "The house needs a caretaker to make the walk." The book ended with a single paragraph in block letters: "Do not trust the clock." I took photographs and scribbled notes until my hand cramped. The archive clerk told me the clippings had been donated from multiple local sources and stamped with dates that matched the reports. I asked if anyone had ever tried to investigate further. "We leave those to the Historical Society," she said. The Historical Society files had copies of guest registers and a ledger that recorded a curious regularity: certain names recurring, unremarked, then vanishing around the 1st of January.
I found a folded, typed letter from a man named Elijah Price, dated 1988, complaining of replacements and the scent of borrowed voices that followed them. It was the kind of phrasing you'd expect from someone who had wanted to keep their thoughts to themselves. No one had followed up. Small-town papers treated disappearances as small tragedies and moved on. Back at the hotel, I doubled down. The tape recorder I'd bought for a college assignment, long since repurposed, picked up more than my own voice when I played back the logs. There were gaps, literal gaps of missing 10 or 20-minute intervals where I had no memory of the time. I found entries in my own handwriting I didn't remember making. A note on the mirror that read, "Check the cellar." A quick scrawl at 2:12 a.m., "Stop the lever." I was practiced enough at maintenance to know my own habits, which made those gaps creep towards something else. Physical evidence started to stack in a way that made disbelief heavy. The first thing was tracks. On the far side of the property, near a ring of stone plantings, I found massive shapes in the snow, 3 impressions that ran along like giant boot soles, every print far larger than a human foot, and with a raggedness at the edges as if claws had been dragged. They did not belong to any animal I could name. The prints led from the tree line to the hotel's back wall, and then stopped, as if whoever left them had either folded into the structure or evaporated. Inside, on the service door, there were scuffs high up when nothing of reasonable height could reach. I photographed everything. The camera timestamps were another anchor: 12/31/2022, 23:08 for the tracks, 23:22 for the scuffs, 23:40 for a still that would later be the center of an argument I'd have with myself. In that last still, on the back porch light, there was a glint, an outline like a face, but blurred as if the camera and the thing had a disagreement about being in the same frame. I installed a small motion camera outside the greenhouse and set it to record overnight, thinking of deer and squirrels and the more reasonable explanations. The footage, when I checked it at 2:15 a.m., showed static and atmospheric drift. At 2:42 a.m., the camera had recorded a figure moving with too smooth a gait. At 2:45 a.m., the frame stuttered, and a second exposure seemed to overlay itself, a shadow where there had been a person before. When I paused and blew up the pixels on my laptop, I saw the face again, something like mine, but as if underwater. The image had a horizontal line running through it, like a page crease. I keep these images saved as backup 0242, and I study them because even now I want to hold on to the feeling of rationality that comes from looking at a file you can open. The next clue came as an old key in the tray behind the front desk. At first I thought I'd missed it. It was an iron thing, cold and heavy, with 3 notches. The tag on it read, "Staff Basement, Remove Display."
There was another key ring with 2 brass keys labeled Cellar 1 and Cellar 2. I took them because keys are the language of access. They felt meaningful. I walked across the lobby and found the cellar door under the carpet runner that led to the service corridor. The steps smelled of oil and boiled metal. On a shelf in the furnace room, I found a metal box bolted to the wall, a plate on it that read Hawthorne Boundary Control, and a small padlock that had been set aside. The box itself was empty, except for a drawer lined with aged paper and an old ledger whose cover was cracked open. Inside the ledger, I found a folded letter. The handwriting was the neat, deliberate script of William Blackwell. The letter was short, typed in a crisp serif. It began, "To whoever keeps watch, the hotel is a machine that feeds on faith in its rules." It described a system I was not prepared for, a practice of maintaining a boundary, an arrangement of symbols and placements around the property, a process of preparing a replacement, and the cost of failing to honor the cycle. It spoke in euphemism and then in plain terms. A single sentence made my chest hollow. "You will be asked, if you are careful, to destroy what waits in the cellar when the clock breaks, but understand that destroying the mechanism will not return what will be changed in you." He signed W. Blackwell,
and at the bottom he'd attached a single admonition: "The boundary is a contract." It looked like melodrama when I first read it. It looked like someone trying to make sense of the senseless. But the ledger held other things: diagrams of the grounds with marks at regular intervals, stones, posts, tree hollows, forming a ring. On the margins were notes. One of 1 cycles noted: "Transfer aligns with midnight. Place duplicate in containment." The language slid between mechanical and mythic. There was a page with a crude drawing of a figure beneath glass in a chamber, and a note: "Sleepers accept memory bleed. Awaken as they are fed identity." I read that line 3 times. I tell you all this because you must see the scaffolding I built around doubt. It was my attempt to hold on to the human order of things. I tried to make it mechanical, a machine, a series of levers, a pattern repeated because someone had been repeating it for years. William Blackwell's voice in the ledger was not an instruction manual so much as a confession. It implied a choice had been made before me, and it implied, more dangerous, that the choice was still being made. He did not say when the process began in the house's life, only that it had been in operation long enough to make a pattern. I found the hidden maps by following a map in the ledger, a fold that slid loose when I nudged it with my fingernail. It revealed itself like a secret index, the hotel perimeter with markings identical to the carvings I'd found on the hedges. Each mark corresponded to a foundation stone, a chimney flue, a particular oak that leaned east.
The ring shaped a boundary not of lines but of attention. The ledger claimed that the attention could be managed. The mechanism described circuits of mirrors and tubes and the receptacle chamber, a place the ledger said was below ground and tempered with glass and iron. It mentioned sleepers as a category, people placed inside as a way of preserving a life for later release. The more evidence I stacked, the more my disbelief started to thicken into a particular flavor of fear, the one that comes when events begin to match paperwork. The camera images, the ledger, the carved symbols, the repeating faces in the newspapers, they configured into a logic that felt like a sentence finishing itself. When I traced my finger along the inked map in the ledger, I found a note in a different hand slid between pages, a quick scrawl: "Don't let midnight pass without checking the cellar." The scrawl was in a hand that looked hurried, more Rorschach than letter. It might have been a later note. It might have belonged to someone panicked. For all my rational training, I let the note guide me. That night, December 31st, I prepared differently. I checked the generator, logged pressure and temperature, taped a small rig of flashlights near the cellar door, and set the motion cameras in a spoke around the property, one by the hedges, one facing the stone ring, one near the greenhouse. I put the satellite phone on top of the console, and a small red light blinked across its top like an eye. Time, which earlier was a calendar of convenience, tightened. The clock on the wall ticked through my hours. I had the uneasy sense of being watched and of walking into a room that everyone had left a chair in, waiting. At 11:45 p.m., the lobby held its breath like a lung. Outside, the wind flattened the snow into waves. The camera facing the back door picked up movement along the tree line at 11:54. It was not an animal. The motion sensor registered a slow approach. I brewed tea and forced myself to drink. I checked my watch, 11:57. Something about the minutes before midnight deserves description, because the ordinary world rearranges inside them like cards sliding together. The clock on the wall leaned toward midnight in a way I'd seen in films, but never here, never in my life. The lights in the banquet room dimmed, and then steadied, as if someone tested the dimmers with a cautious hand. The air filled with a low vibration, not from the generator, but as if the building itself were clearing its throat. I walked to the cellar with a key in hand. The iron key fit the padlock and turned with a sound I would later hear in my sleep. The stairs down were steep and smelled of damp brick and oil. I had the flashlight in my teeth and the headlamp on, the strap biting my skull. The cellar was larger than I expected, a low cavern under foundations and pipes. There, in the center, under a beam, was the chamber the ledger had sketched, a low metal frame, thick glass, and other fittings.
To the side, a panel of controls with a series of switches labeled with numbers and dates. Dust had settled on it in the shape of interrupted hours. I did not find a sleeping person at first. I found instruments and the echo of equipment. But as my light swept the room, it found a figure curled in a cot inside a glass enclosure. Pale, folded, a face turned away as if in sleep. It looked like someone in a white hospital gown, the hair dark against the pillow. The features were indistinct from this angle. A tag hung from the wrist with a date. On a clipboard attached to the enclosure, a single sheet was clipped with neat orders. Transfer schedule, replace at 0000. A sliver of handwriting below it read in the same neat script, remember to wake with the bell. My throat tightened in a way I'd never felt before. I wrote the time on a scrap of paper and stuck it in my notebook. 12/31/2022, 23:59. The bell was a brass thing on the console outside the enclosure that looked innocuous enough to be furniture. The ledger had warned of rituals, and I laughed at myself then, merciful laughter that trembled like a thin glass. Rituals are vocabulary for people who want rules. The panel had a big lever. It was labeled with a faded sticker, boundary release. Beside it were two photographs clipped to the console with a metal clip. One was grainy and old, a man in a suit on the steps of the house dated 1952, his face dull as old coin. The other was a glossy, modern headshot dated 2015. The two faces were similar in the way strangers on a train sometimes are similar, features that echo. Between them, someone had placed a strip of film that caught the light like a cake of ice. I remember that, as I stood there, 3 minutes until midnight, my hands trembled not from cold but from a kind of understanding. The ledger had sketched a puppet of a system that used a replacement, a sleeper in containment that could be awakened to take on a life and a memory. The word transfer implies two hands. Who, I thought, was holding the other end? The satellite phone on the console was dark. The emergency battery in my pocket was at 9%. The room seemed to lean in toward the console, and I felt a pressure at my ribs that matched the rise of a tide. Then the clock hands moved, not like hands on a page, but like teeth sliding open. The hotel held a single long minute that felt like a held breath inside a glass jar. And when the clock on the wall hit midnight, I heard something like a breath through iron. The motion camera outside the back door registered a burst of activity at exactly 00000. The ground shivered. The kettle on the stove in the staff kitchen shuddered. The small red light on the satellite phone blinked and went steady. The bell, I realized, was not ornamental. It did not ring when you expected it to. It vibrated in a tone that seemed to move through the air rather than the ear.
When it began, the glass around the sleeper clouded, as if breath had fogged the inside of the enclosure. The face inside turned slowly toward the sound. I put my hand on the lever because the ledger had said someone would be asked to act. I expected the consequence to be mechanical. Pull, the system resets, the house breathes. What I did not expect was the sense of stitches inside my head loosening. The figure in the glass opened its eyes, and for a second the world rearranged itself. I saw not a stranger, but myself reflected. The scar at the left brow, the exact line of the mouth. For a terrible instant I thought it was me. My hand on the lever trembled, and the lights in the cellar seemed to thin like tissue. The corridor above me groaned. Outside I could hear something large move through the snow. The photograph on the console shook as if a wind had passed over it. In the same second that my fingers contacted the lever more firmly, I heard a voice in the recorder in my pocket that was not my voice, but the ghost of all the voices that had been recorded in the ledger. "You have to choose," it said. The sound was not coming from outside the glass, but from inside the room where my confidence had always lived. The lever pulled up in my hand like a line in water. The mechanism clicked, and then a soft hiss. The glass steamed further, and the face in the enclosure sank like a boat taking on water. The features folded and reformed in a way that made me want to retch. I had expected to save someone. I had expected to break something. I did not realize then why my hand moved to the fire extinguisher, but I did register that the ledger's phrase, "destroy what waits in the cellar," had felt like a choice between life and the house's hunger. I set the extinguisher's nozzle to the seam of the machine and thought clumsily of flame. I thought of burning the ledger. I thought of 100 amateur heroic acts. The first part of the night ends here, because the rest of the things that happened are difficult to put downwards in linear time without hurting the truth of how they felt. There are photographs and timestamps that mark the edges of the moments, and there are my own words, written in a notebook with a pen that shook. At the threshold of midnight, with my fingers on a lever and the sleeper opening its eyes, and a bell that sounded like a thing giving itself up, something inside the cellar answered to me in a language made of memory and hunger. The ledger's warning, "The boundary is a contract," hung in the air like smoke. I left a note nailed to the inside of the cellar door before I climbed back to the lobby. It read, "Check the camera footage. Do not trust the glass." I clipped the page to the ledger and shut the light. The lobby looked the way it had when I first walked in, immaculate, expectant. My watch was wet with condensation. My hands trembled. I could hear the town clock a mile away begin to strike the new year.
The file names on my camera are Backup 12/31/2342, Backup 01/01/0003. They mark small islands of time where I still had reason. The things I do not yet tell you in exact sequence are the things I am trying to protect you from reading with a simple consumption. What I can give you now are the documents: a photo of the ledger, a clipping of the newspapers, a security still with an opaque outline in the frame, and the handwritten list I taped to the mirror that said in shaky block letters, "Do not let it out." The evidence sits, patient and ugly, in the hard drive with a name like Backup Final. There are voices in the town that will tell you to avoid the Hawthorne House. There are letters in the ledger that name a system in which a hotel feeds on careful orders and obedient people. There are rings of carved symbols around the grounds like punctuation marks. And there is the thing I learned that is worst of all: the rules change after midnight. I did not then understand the full price of ignoring that sentence. I only knew that something had changed the instant the clock passed 12, and that my hand had made a decision. The rest followed on the frequency of that decision: the sound of glass, the hiss of a release, the camera framing two overlapping exposures of the same face. When I climbed the stairs back into the lobby at 0003, the hotel felt like a throat. The motion camera files would later show that something left the grounds at 0012, moving toward the town in a gait you do not expect from people. The journal will show entries in my own hand with hours blacked out, and the ledger will show a blank entry that did not exist the morning before. The ring of symbols around the hotel would stand in the snow like little mouths opened to the sky. This is where I stop for now, at the moment the hotel exhaled, and before the town opened its doors. I have kept the ledger, the photographs, and the camera files. I have tried to name what I did that night without giving myself the mercy of easy answers. I took the shift because I needed the money. The rules, I discovered, were not mine. They belonged to the house. There is more on the hard drive, and there are more entries in the ledger, and there are people who will tell you I made the wrong choice. I will tell you only that when the clock struck midnight, the house offered me a bargain that looked like a machine and tasted like a memory. My fingers closed around the lever. The glass fogged. A face turned toward me. The bell sang. The rest, that is the part that needs unpacking, and it will take more than one night to tell. When I went back down into the cellar that night, I thought my hands would be steady enough to finish what I'd started. The ledger's ink had weight. The newspaper clippings and the camera stills fit together like a half-told confession. If there was a choice, I told myself, it was to stop a cycle. If there was a bargain, it was mine to refuse.
The motion files told me something had left the grounds at 0012. The footage I watched after, Backup 01010012, shows a shape cutting across the snow in a gait that is wrong for people. It moves with economy, like a thing used to moving without attention. The camera stalls, reasserts itself, and then the frame blurs as if someone pushed the lens with a thumb. It heads toward the town, and then it's gone. I watched it 3 times. Each replay felt like a hand closing on my sternum. I told myself the right move was to check the cellar again. I told myself I had to be certain. The lobby air was thin. The satellite phone blinked, obediently alive. On the front desk, a voicemail icon pulsed with 2 new messages. One was from Marjorie, recorded at 007. "If you have any sense, you left. We don't talk about it." The other was from Beth, my sister, time-stamped 0011, short and panicked. "Thomas, answer me. You promised you'd be careful. Please, call me." I punched the cellar key into my pocket and took the service stairs 2 at a time. My breath came in wet ropes. The light in the furnace room threw the world in glare. The chamber lay where it had been, but something had altered the space. The controls that had been dormant now had dust scoured away in tracks of recent fingers. One of the dials had been set to a date I didn't expect to see, 1/1/2023, and beneath the glass of the sleeper enclosure, the figure had changed position. Instead of lying curled, the person inside sat upright, hands clutching at the sheet as if remembering how to move. I had expected a stranger. I had not expected the recognition to be so pure. The face inside the glass was a precise echo. The scar on the left brow, the same crooked line of the smile. Clipped to the cot was a small index card, my name, Thomas, written in my own handwriting as if some previous version of me had left the card there in case memory wavered. The tag said Sleeper 01, to be awakened 0000, but it also bore a later scrawl in a shaky hand I could not place. Do not let it leave. I stood with one hand on the glass. My reflection layered over the sheet-wrapped figure like a double exposure. For the first time that night, the ledger's abstruse terms scraped into clarity. The transfer was not allegory. It was literal, a life kept for release,
Memory bled into a shell to set someone free. Above the console, a small bell waited, a clacker that could call awake what lay inside. The lever I had touched earlier sat in rest position, but there was a second control, a heavy steel bar with a padlock on it and an adjacent panel labeled Containment Heat. The wiring looked old, the switches marked with dates and initials. I remembered William Blackwell's letter, destroy what waits in the cellar, but also his warning, destroying the mechanism will not return what will be changed in you. In that line there was the thing I had not wanted, a guarantee that choices have consequences beyond the mechanical.
I thought briefly of faith, something I had always carried as a private thing, like a lighter in my pocket. Would I be the person who wound the mechanism shut forever? Would the ledger's pattern stop? Or would I simply trade one form of horror for another? Release for infection, safety for an unholy freedom. The headlamp's strap bit my forehead. My fingers had the shaken certainty of a man choosing whether to pull a trigger. I had a crowbar in the boiler room, a standard maintenance tool. I could smash the glass, cut the tubing, wreck the panels and cables. I could set the containment chamber alight with grease-soaked rags and the old welding flux in the rack. I could destroy the machine here and now and call it justice. I did not think of malice. I thought of the faces in the town records, each captioned with an ordinary name and a date. Last seen 1/2/2001. Left property 1/1/2015. I thought of Marjorie's eyes in the dim archive light, the way she had brushed dust from a clipping, as if dust could be coaxed into telling its secrets. I thought of Beth's last text, the last unplayed voicemail that sat like a small, bright accusation. So I took the crowbar and set my shoulder to the glass, like a man who had practiced his boldness in otherwise small things. The metal screamed in my hands when it hit. The glass cracked, a web of silver that caught the light like frost. The figure inside answered with a noise that could have been a human sound, and could have been the house rearranging itself around a new axis. Steam rose in a thin line from the seam. The face inside focused on me with the slow lucidity of someone pulling on a long, muddy rope. It moved as if memory had been distributed across someone else's sleep. It brushed at the tag on its wrist and found the letters, my name. There was a flicker of comprehension. It whispered something that sounded like my own name. The sound came out ragged, a borrowed voice worn in. It reached for me through the webbed glass like someone trying to touch a reflection. I hit the lever that would, in the ledger's terminology, release the house's claim. I expected the machine to die, to shudder like a clock winding down. Instead, the world split into two kinds of ticking, the mechanical, a baritone click of gears, and another rhythm, quick and insectile, that seemed to come from inside my ribs. The bell on the console sang in a low register that felt like small metal lungs inflating. The containment panels thumped, misting filth. The sleeper's eyes widened, and then the glass began to peel outwards, not like a door opening, but like a skin slipping. I felt then a drag at the edges of my thoughts. It was as if language itself was being realigned in my head. Words slid under me like stepping stones. For a breath, I could see past the level of my own experience. Old photographs of men who had stood in my shoes, whole lives written in ledger entries, and the same slow incline towards an unset hunger.
The sleeper inside the enclosure was not the only thing that had been holding memory. The place had been feeding on the pattern of identity for so long that it could hand portions of it like currency. The glass broke with a sound that was less violent than patient. I had imagined heroism would be clean. It is never clean. When I struck the chamber's mechanical heart with the crowbar, it did not stop so much as reconfigure. Sparks crawled along the panels and black smoke licked from the wiring. The containment field, something the ledger had described as tempered attention, snapped like a taut string ran through a serrated blade. The sleeper's breath hit the air like a strike of cold. The bell died in a ragged gasp. And then the injury in me announced itself. At first it was a small, ridiculous change. My fingertips went numb, as if the cold had traveled through bone. My hearing sharpened. The hum of the generator, the rustle of a mouse in a wall, the echo of a pipe somewhere under the floors. Each sound pinpointed itself in the panorama of the hotel. A scent rose, oils, lemon, and something older and meatless, the dry, sweet smell of a place that has kept secrets so long it has turned them into a seasoning. Under my skin, something like old sap began to knit itself into new tissue. A pressure pooled behind my teeth. I set the crowbar down and grabbed the extinguisher because it felt like an instrument I could use. I sprayed at the console, at the glowing coils, at the smoking panels, until the hiss of foam sounded as if it were trying to drown something alive. When the flames took, They took in mustard-bright slashes, and the machine sighed like a great animal dying. The sleeper slumped, but not into stillness. Instead, the person in the cot rolled onto the floor like someone shedding last night's clothes, and stood. For a moment, the two of us, myself and the thing wearing my face, looked at each other like travelers meeting on an unmarked road. Its eyes were mine and not mine, familiar in the geometry of bone, wrong in the way the pupils reflected the light. It smiled with a mouth that had learned speech from my own gestures. It reached out a hand, and there was something in that gesture, an offering, a demand, a recognition, that knocked the breath from my lungs. Between the clanging panels and the flare of fumes, I made the decision that would hold me like a stone. I would destroy what waited in the cellar. I would break the mechanism that allowed identities to be ferried from one shell to another. I would make sure nobody else paid for the hotel's appetite. I did not see then that making sure could be cruelty of a different sort. I tore cables from their mounts with bare hands. I found the fuse box and ripped the dusty fuses out like teeth. The sleeper, my double, watched me with a stillness that did not read as comprehension so much as attendance. When I picked up the crowbar again, it felt heavier, as if weighted by consequence.
When the bulk of the machine was broken, when metal lay like broken ribs across the floor of the cellar, the air changed. The hotel drew in and sighed, and the ring of cymbals outside thrummed with an energy I could taste. Iron, ozone, a tang that reminded me of pennies polished with lemon. My head swam with images, the ledger's map, the carved hedges, the list of names in the archive. The choices I had thought of as separate, the destroying and the freeing, folded like paper into a single action that could not be disentangled. I had broken the boundary to stop a cycle. That break did exactly what Blackwell's line promised. It did not return me to what I had been. I felt the first change in the mouth. My tongue thickened as if coated in bark. There was a metallic edge to taste. The muscles at the back of my throat began to harden. Sounds, before only ambient nuisance, sharpened into narrative. The tiniest click in the attic read to me like sentences, the distant skitter in a field like punctuation. My skin became a patchwork of heat and cold. It hummed like wiring. My lungs found a new rhythm, shallow and fast, like the roof of a beast sniffing air. Psychology, the ledger had suggested, was a thing that could be, in part, administered. Identity could be transferred. What it had not said aloud was how porous that transfer left everyone. The hotel had, in a long and slow habit, been trading microscopic bits of a person, traces of hunger, half-remembered songs, a preference for how to stoke a fire, between the shell and the thing that fed. When I shattered the mechanism, I broke a dam between horrifying compartments. The memories that had been banked in glass and iron flooded. With them came something the ledger skirted with euphemism, the Guardian. No one had written the Guardian's name in clear ink in the archive. The town called it a whisper. Blackwell had called it a machine's appetite. In the margins of pages that were phrases, the thing the town whispers about, and that was as near as anyone had come to an honest noun. The creature that the hotel had kept at bay by promising a replacement once a cycle was not simply a beast with fangs. It was a boundary rendered sentient, an organism of ritual and memory that would take shape as the room allowed. When the containment died, the air in the cellar folded like a hand, and something answered. It was the rise of a presence in the room that felt like the crowding of 1,000 small attentions into one larger one. I felt it first as pressure at my sternum, then as a shifting under the skin behind my clavicle, as if a small stone were being set under my bones. I remember a flash of thinking, too human and quick, about Beth, about breathing her name, about driving away. The roster of small human escapes unspooled, call a friend, sleep in the car, surrender to the police, and each one collapsed inward, like a map folded one time too many.
I staggered up the cellar stairs with the crowbar tucked like a prayer against my ribs. The hotel above had become a different organism. The floorboards hummed. The lights were not quite steady. The lobby's clock had lost the polite Roman it had had earlier, and now recycled through beats uneven and urgent. My hands were slick with soot and some other residue I could not name. The satellite phone on the counter displayed a battery and 3 missed calls. Beth, Marjorie, unknown. There were 2 texts from Beth. Thomas, please, tell me you're okay. I tried the keys to the service van. The ignition turned and the engine coughed like a throat clearing. The van moved, but the steering had the feeling of someone pulling at it on the other end.
I wrestled the wheel, but the vehicle did not accelerate with the ease it should have. Snow crusted the driveway like scabs. Behind the wheel, something changed in me quickly. My hands clung to controls with a preternatural strength, but my sense of distance shifted. The lines of the road grew thinner and longer, like the strings of a puppet show. The car would not go fast. I tried to call Beth. The call connected and then ran to voicemail. Her voice message was short, 2 small breaths of a woman trying too hard not to panic. "Thomas, answer. I'm calling the hotel, please. If you don't pick up, I'm coming there." There was a beat where I heard the bag sounds, fabric rustling. Then another voice, my own, or someone trying on my voice, singing a song I'd hummed as a kid about the ocean. The message ended with a bark of static. I drove, as fast as the van would allow, down the long approach and onto the road that led to town. Snow slotted under the tires. I thought of the ledger again. "You will be asked, if you are careful, to destroy what waits in the cellar." Because it was not until I had already destroyed it that I fully understood the phrasing. The ledger had written as if the caretaker were performing a duty at the direction of a larger system. I had destroyed the mechanism. Someone, somewhere, inside the architectural lattice of the hotel, reacted. The change in me accelerated. It wasn't lore so much as attention. I could sense the way light pooled at the edge of a lamppost. I could hear how a man's boots hit a wooden porch 3 houses ahead. The world came into relation not as something I navigated, but as something that answered me back. It was not power. It was a narrowing into hunger. My mouth tasted of iron. I thought of the duplicates in the bindings and the ledger entries where faces reappeared. I thought suddenly, with the crystalline sadness of a person who knows the thing they plan to prevent will now wear their shape, that my choice had been both sacrificial and selfish. If the replacement model no longer fed the hotel as it had, the Guardian would adapt. Town was closer than I expected.
I passed Marjorie's library, a small brick building with the late-night light still on, like a watchful eye. Inside, the archive's window showed nothing but pale rose, empty because the archivist had left her desk to call me, perhaps, to plead with me in a voice that meant leave. I thought of stopping. I thought of knocking on the glass and hollering the truth. Don't open the doors, close the ring, burn the ledger. But language slipped under my intention like a coin under a curtain. I could sense other movements now, people stirring, without seeing them, as if the town's life were an undercurrent I could feel when I held my palm to a table. I drove to the old mill road because somewhere in the ledger there had been a note about a hill where you could see the hotel like a bruise on the horizon. Part of me wanted to see whether the thing that had been let loose had already reached the road. Part of me wanted to outrun it. In the rearview mirror, the hotel receded like a dark tooth. The van's headlights caught a set of tracks in the snow that did not belong to any vehicle, rows of impressions 2 by 2, like a double set of feet walking side by side, heading toward the center of town. My hands tightened on the wheel until the knuckles went white. I thought, absurdly, of children, of Beth's laugh when we were younger and impractical things happened in the house, and we told each other we were making stories. I imagined her intersection with this night, and realized the worst part of what I'd done would be how personal it now felt. I had believed I could prevent harm. I had instead become the vector of harm. I parked in a lot near the diner because it was a lighted place. I left the van running with the heater on. The snow outside was soft and the world smelled like something half clean and half old. For a moment, human civility sat over everything like a thin cloth. Neon beer signs, a couple at a corner table, someone folding a newspaper. Then movement began at the edges. A man stepping out of an alley with a coat collar up, a figure on a porch who paused like a note held too long. My senses tracked them as if tracing the edge of a page. I walked down the street. The town noticed me as if noting a pattern they recognized. People's eyes slid toward my face with the particular prick of recognition you feel when you meet someone with whom you have, in some strange past, changed positions. Some of the faces I passed mirrored the archive photos, older men and older women whose features echoed the ledger's reproductions. A woman on her stoop clutched a photograph to her chest like a talisman. When she looked at me, her mouth dropped open. She put a hand to her mouth and whispered a name from the ledger like a prayer, and it was my name. "Stop," she said. "Please, Jay, stop it." She thought her neighbor was someone else. She thought the reappearance of my face meant the house had returned a child or a lover.
She had no way of knowing the internal architecture of what I had done. She had no way of understanding that identity had been cashed like a check, and I had tried to stop the bank from losing anyone else. Between us, for the fraction of a second, a mutual recognition unspooled. She understood that the face she had trusted to return was not right. I understood, with bone-deep clarity, that the watchers in that town would now be watching for a reason they would interpret as rescue.
The wrongness of it made her step back. That step back was enough. I felt a shift inside me like a hinge moving. Some animal answer rose within my chest. Protect, track, possess. The hunger sharpened into a purpose that felt not unlike the impetus to survive. I didn't realize then how quickly my moral language would mutate into something more utilitarian. To keep the terrible from spreading, I would have to become the terrible. I told myself, in the last human way I could, that this was an acceptable calculus. I would smother myself to stop the spread. I would walk off a cliff. I would do what William Blackwell had done before, pen warnings and schematics, and then remove myself from the world. I tried to get back to the van. My legs moved, but my distance perception misaligned. I tripped, and for a brutal second I tasted the edge of my own panic. Salt, copper, the living question of whether to fight or to run. A boy across the street asked if I was okay, and laughed nervously when I didn't answer. I tried to speak, and my voice came out thick, not quite mine. He took a step back as if I had been struck by a sudden winter storm. I thought again about the ledger and the photograph in the guest book. The faces repeating across decades weren't a family line or an inheritance. They were, the ledger had implied, and I had seen and then broken, a series of people used like placeholders. I had hoped to end that. Perhaps, I thought, the best ending was to deny the guardian shelter in the world by denying it my own shape. I considered driving to the river and plunging the van off the bridge, an end in one neat motion, where nothing could be loosed upon a wider canvas. It was the thought of my sister, eyes like the early snow and trust like a small coin, that stopped me from setting the wheel that way. The notion of her at my funeral or the discovery of my body was something I could not accept. Mercy for me had become an abstract currency I could not spend. Instead, the change completed itself in stages nobody could name. My vision sharpened to the periphery. I could see, in the grain of a fence post, the imprint of someone who had once leaned against it. Sound became a text I could parse, the hum of a refrigerator like a low word, the click of a lighter like punctuation. Memory, my memories, no longer felt wholly mine. They came as if from a library with a torn binding. Names hovered like dust motes. W. Blackwell, Elizabeth from the ledger, Marjorie.
I tried to anchor myself by saying Beth's name aloud. The syllables came out wrong, reverbed in a voice that belonged to an animal with a human tongue. They found me before dawn. It was not dramatic. It was the small, terrible way that familiarity invites complacency. The woman with the photograph called the police when she saw me in the diner parking lot because I had the face of the ledger and the movement of a stranger. A cruiser pulled up and 2 officers stepped between us. Their hands were slow and careful. They asked for my identification. The sound of their voices threaded through my new sensory map like lines on a map. I handed over a wallet with my license inside, Thomas Mitchell, and when the officer looked at my photo, his face lost a secret muscle's control. He said my name with a ledger's reverence, a word like an answer. "Funny," he said. "You look like someone we used to have around here." I tried to explain. I tried to give them the sequence: contract, ledger, containment, but the words came in fragments. They looked at my hands and saw the crowbar smears. They saw the soot on my jacket. I saw pity and fear cross and rearrange itself into something like strategy. The woman with the photograph stepped forward and said, "You can't be here. You have to leave. We have rules." "Why?" I asked. The sound came out wrong. I could feel an edge inside my cheek that stretched like a seam. The officer's radio squawked, and someone in the back ward said they'd received reports of a disturbance at the hotel and that the archives were being locked down. There would be nothing to be done tonight, they said, and left it as a human thing to do with their hands, a postponement. I walked away because walking felt like the only reasonable thing to do. I put distance between the quiet diner and the white clapboard houses. Snow fell like ash. The town shifted in its sleepiness. Windows blinked open and faces peered cautiously. A dog began to bark at some distance. When it saw me, it turned and fled like a small boat frightened by wind. Its reaction amplified the change in people, as if the animal had sounded the true alarm. I don't remember exactly when the hallucinations started, if you want an honest chronology. Some nights I can't tell whether I remember events themselves or the photos I took later that prove what I had thought. For a while, I cataloged everything in the hard drive: photo names, camera timestamps, email subject lines. There is a folder on that drive labeled Final Audio Text with a file called Voicemail Beth 0101018 and a note in my hand that reads, "Do not call back." I left that note because in the moment I thought the best mercy was silence.
the saving grace of someone kept from a horror. Later, when I listened to the file, her voice sounded both tender and weary. "I can come," she said. "I can drive up today. Tell me where you are." I had not told her.
When the first person ran when they saw me, the panic that set into the town was like a light you can't switch off. People gathered at their doors. Someone banged on a neighbor's window. Rumor moves faster than the facts, and soon the town had a narrative. A man who looked like the photographs in the ledger had been seen loose and wandering. Someone called the mayor. The police organized a casual patrol. I could feel their attention as a pressure point on the world, scanning like falconers. The Guardian, whatever it was, would have been learning as well, tracking the town's responses with a patience older than the houses. I felt the last of my human resolve peel away like bark. The hunger in me no longer felt purely hunger for flesh or violence. It was a desire to be in motion, to test the boundaries of what the town might accept. The architecture of the world had become prey to a new sensory system. I wanted to be outside of the hotel, where the air was stale and the lights burned like an invitation. I wanted to see what the town would look like under this new knowledge I carried. My last clear human decision was to keep Beth away from that knowledge. I pictured her at the end of my life, face small and angular, not the face of a ledger photo, but tender and mundane. She was not part of the architecture of the house. She was a person with a laugh and bad coffee preferences, and a stack of unpaid bills like herding cats. I could not let her be an unwitting participant. That thought held me like a prayer, even as the rest of me rewired into something else. But I was not fast enough to exile myself with collateral. By dawn, the streets were full of people who had woken to the rumor and decided to arm themselves with their own certainties. Flashlights, baseball bats, their neighborhood's moral architectures. They thought they could reclaim what looked familiar. A man with a pickup tried to block my path. A woman across the street screamed my name as if testing the sound, and in that instant I understood why the ledger had been kept so hush-hush. They all wanted to see identity return to its rightful place, the missing caretaker made whole. The Guardian, if I had to name it, was not some mythic beast that arrived in a storm of teeth. It was subtler, intimately sociable. It had been made by a system that trusted repetition. It wore the shape of people it had been fed for years. As the town gathered, something in me, driven by impulse or by the hotel's training, walked toward the crowd. The way people moved in the snow created a pattern I could read. Fear, surprise, the urge to come together like a single organism. I saw Beth then, at the far edge of the crowd, running toward me with a look that undid me. She had the look of someone who did not yet understand what being human asks of her. Courage in its naive, pure form. She pushed through the crowd. "Thomas," she said, what did you do?" I saw my face reflected in her eyes, and it felt like a betrayal I had not yet committed. I opened my mouth to tell her to go, to leave, to run in the direction the ledger suggested. Do not let the boundary be crossed. But the words were jarred. My throat was not the same. I felt my jaw shift, a small, sick readjustment, as if teeth had been rearranging. My tongue tasted of iron. The hunger in me rose like a tide. "Beth," I tried. Her hand reached for mine, and for the first time since the cellar, I felt something I recognized as love, the hot smallness of a human plea. For a sliver, the old wiring flashed on. I could have said anything. Leave, run, forgive me. But the hotel's bell and the ruin of the machine and the pressure of everything I'd broken had altered me past the point of choosing mercy simply. The thing in me, the Guardian's echo, rose up like a voice in an old throat. Something in the crowd screamed. It could have been the man's dog that started first, or the neighbor who had always been sensible and suddenly felt like a child. A scatter of people moved back. A man swung a bat, and for a second I thought I might be hurt like a human being. The bat hit my shoulder, and my body responded with a surge of protective heat that was not quite pain and not quite triumph. I felt galvanic. The world rearranged into cause and effect in which I was the center. I do not remember when I stopped trying to be human. Memory from that moment fractures into images. The light on Beth's face as she reeled back. The glitter of the diner sign. The sound of the town clock chiming late morning like metal. I remember a child's toy rolling in the gutter and my hands closing around the boy who had dropped it, as if that were the natural order of the world. The boy's mother screamed. The crowd surged. I moved through them like a force that had learned new priorities. I moved toward the edge of town because the hotel's pattern, like a distant signal, seemed to pull me there,
and that is what the ledger had always whispered. We maintain the line by moving its points. Later, people would tell versions of what followed that differed from my own sensory record. They would say I ran like a man possessed. They would say I smiled with a face that was too familiar, that I left footprints like a weird twin in the snow. There are photographs, caller-camera-02-020, where you can see a figure in motion. There are grainy clips where a person with my face walks into the trees and is not seen again until a neighbor raises an alarm and the town mobilizes. The morning paper the next day carried a headline that read, "Strange Sighting on Mill Road." There was a subheading about confusion and wonder, and a photograph of boot prints leading from the slip of road out toward the larger highway. I did not plan to become a monster. I planned to be the man who fixes things. I planned to pay the rent.
In the end, the choice had become, suddenly and horribly, not between saving and not saving, but between forms of damage. Destroy the sleeper and release the hunger. Let the transfer proceed and send another human into the town. I chose to break things. That choice did not absolve me. It made me its vessel. What I remember in the bright, thin hours that followed is a kind of mechanical exaltation, the clean efficiency of movement and the corrosion of language. When I turned toward the line of trees that separated the hotel property from the main road, the world was a map, and I could read the contours in a way I'd never been able to. The town is a small net. Once you know how to tug at one point, the rest rearranges. The hotel had taught me to tug. I thought for a second of the ledger's last page and its capital letters, "Do not trust the clock." The clock had not been wrong. The rules had changed after midnight. They always changed after midnight. They still do. In the days after, the town held a meeting, and a group went out with dogs and flashlights and a kind of ritual certainty. They combed the hedgerows and the old mill road. They found nothing but boot prints in snow that had started to melt. They found a scrap of torn fabric snagged on a bramble. They left candles on stoops. They pinned typed copies of the ledger's pages to the community board, not because they believed in its content, but because they wanted a story to hold. They wanted narrative more than truth. They wanted closure. The ledger and the hard drive and the photos I saved sit now in a box at the bottom of a dresser in a rented room 2 towns away. I keep them because there is a part of me that still wants to be accountable, and because someone who finds them may piece together a path others can watch. There is a folder named Photos Final, with images labeled Backup 01010012 and Backup 01010015 and File Ledger Scan. There is a voicemail file with Beth's name on it that I cannot bring myself to delete. Every so often I listen to her voice in the middle of the night, a small, impossible mercy. People ask whether the cycle stopped. They ask whether the town has been free. The truth is both smaller and more terrifying. The mechanism I broke no longer sits in its neat glass cage, but the pattern it enforced has become something else, diffuse, adaptive. The Guardian, if that is what the thing was, learned around the boundary's new fissure. It adapted to use me for the same reasons the hotel had used others: repetition, familiarity, the human tendency to trust a face it recognizes. I had intended to make a stand. Instead, I had made myself the exemplum through which the boundaries learned new strategies. Sometimes in quiet hours when the snow is thin and the moon is a coin, I feel the stirrings of that thing inside me. They are small at first. The hairs on my arms lift. The sound of a siren in the distance tastes like memory. I have so far been able to keep Beth away.
She calls on birthdays, on anniversaries of small private things. I answer sometimes and we exchange banalities. The harder questions I cannot bring myself to ask her. How do you tell a person you love that the face they trusted now walks a line between human and something else? How do you ask them to live in a town that may again give and take in ledgered cycles? I have tried, for weeks, to trace the pattern in the archive more carefully. The clippings are a thin lattice. Between lines there are notes that suggest attempts at prevention. Chains laid across stone circles, burners used to scar the hedges, the odd attempt to burn a ledger. Each attempt collapses on itself because the system is not merely mechanical. It is social. It leverages trust and routine, asking people to act in ways that confirm it. It is a machine that runs partly on the very decency that we trust to protect us. Sometimes I picture William Blackwell in his study, the same way the men in black and white photographs stand with their hands in their pockets. Imagine the ledger passed from hand to hand, the knowledge, the guilt, the choice, like a coin. It is a necklace of decisions around the town's throat. The ledger's final pages read now like a plea rather than a map. Burn the ledger. Close the ring. Keep the clock wound against midnight. Do not let yourselves forget. I have tried all those things in the slow intervals of my new life. I have gone back to the hotel at odd hours and walked its perimeter when I thought the town slept and checked that the rings carved into hedges had been erased. People who saw me then told me I was the hero who had saved them. They gave me coffee and shakes of hands. I left each time like a man who had just lying awake after dreamless sleep, with the taste of metal still in his mouth, and a sense that the world could be made innocent by a simple story. But the ledger will insist upon its evidence, and the archives will continue to show the same faces. People in town will continue to find photographs tucked into guest registers, faces like mine, as if the house can only be satisfied by the human evidence of presence. The machine was not wholly mechanical. It learned to wear our faces like coats. The more we try to close it, the more inventive it becomes. Each broken circuit is a lesson. The last honest thing I can tell you is this. When I think of the moment I pulled the lever and then smashed the containment, the memory is both heroic and grotesque. It was an action made from honest desperation. I can say with certainty that I wanted to stop the house from ever taking someone else, and I can say with equal certainty that I misread the cost. There is a ledger of consequence now that includes my name in a column I cannot unwrite. I have become the answer I once feared. In the end, the hotel exhaled, and a shape left the grounds. The town woke up to an unmanageable embarrassment of evidence and rumor.
People taped notes to telephone poles, and the librarian, Marjorie, placed one of the ledger pages into a binder with her hands shaking. She told me once, in a voice that tried to be calm, that the house will keep doing what it has been taught to do as long as we allow patterns to reign as absolutes. Break a wheel, and the machine will learn a new gear. There are mornings I drive past the Hawthorne House and find the porch light on like an apologetic eye. I check the hedges, and the carved marks are sometimes scarred out with paint and sometimes re-etched overnight. I have come to understand that there is no single fix. The town's rituals, burning, forbidding, marking, are just human tries at an infrastructure that is older and more patient than we are. Yesterday, a child left a drawing nailed to the community board. It was of the hotel, with smiling faces in the windows and a brave sun overhead. A neighbor, practical in her years, stapled another note beside it. If you see something, call the library. Do not go alone. Someone else added, in hurried script, do not let midnight find you unprepared. The last file on the hard drive is a voice memo labeled final_note_01_11. In it, I speak in a voice that sometimes slips into odd cadences. If you find these, I say, then maybe you can do better. Maybe you will not make the same choice I did. I stop and then start again because sometimes I cannot find words. I tell whoever listens that I tried to stop the machine. That is the truth. I tell them I failed. That is also the truth. There is another truth I have to admit. The more time passes, the more the hunger in me learns restraint. It does not go away. It becomes a tool like any other. I can move through a room and feel the edges of people's lives like threads. I can choose not to pull at them. I can choose for a while to be a man who walks the perimeter and keeps his distance. That choice is not redemption. It is merely a slow attempt at reparations. Sometimes, on nights that feel like the underside of a clock, I stand at the rail of a bridge and watch the cars edge by like a row of small lights. I imagine the hotel and the houseways and the ledger bound in rope. I imagine Beth, somewhere, making coffee and living her life with the casual grace of someone who has not been cataloged into a machine's economy. I imagine her calling me on a birthday and me answering with a voice that tries to be only human. If you take anything from this, let it be small and blunt. Contracts with places that teach you to trust patterns are dangerous. Offerings of hurry, of money that arrives without explanation, have finishing clauses. If you ever find a ledger, if you ever find a ring of marks carved in hedges, do not assume you are the hero of the story. The rules change after midnight. They always have in that town. The only thing I can promise with some honesty is this. I acted to stop others from being banked away like currency.
The price I paid was not only my body. The last thing I recorded before I left the town for a season, a file called notes.12.final.mercy, was a line that I didn't want to be poetry, but it wanted to be true. We do not get to be both savior and escape artist. At some point you will choose, and the world will recombine around that choice. If you hear the bells of an old clock in a place you thought was safe, listen to the way the hands move, and remember that rules can change at midnight. Remember to look at what they feed on.
There are footprints in the morning snow that lead out of the Hawthorne House toward the town. They do not end. There are photographs in the archive showing faces that might be mine and might not. There is a voicemail from my sister with 3 small words that ache with ordinary tenderness. Come home, please. I keep that file in the folder named Unplayed, because every time I listen, I am a little less certain whether I am the man who recorded it or some other shape wearing his voice. If you must pass the Hawthorne House on a long white night, do this. Do not answer a bell that rings for you in the middle of your sleep. Do not assume the familiar face you see in a crowd is friend. And if, in the worst calculus, you are asked to destroy what waits in an iron box, remember that the house takes more than metal. It takes the narrow things, taste, cadence, the small way your sister calls your name, to make itself at home in the world. Destroy the mechanism if you must, but know what you are destroying yourself into. I took the New Year's Eve shift because I needed the money. The rest is ledger and burned metal and a conscience that folds in on itself like paper. The rules change after midnight. The town will keep its watch. I keep now a quieter kind of watch, one that tries to hold the pattern open rather than close it. It is a small mercy and perhaps not enough. If this unsettles you, if it keeps your hand on your keys a little longer at night, consider subscribing and reading the files I've left, the ledger scans, the timestamps, the photographs. Look closely. The proof is small and patient. The thing I broke learned to be clever. I have not seen the full cost of that. I suspect I never will. One last image, because that is the lantern people want at the end of a story. In the snow outside the town, there is a sign for the old crossroads, Hawthorne Road, 1 mile, smeared with salt and the tracks of a vehicle long gone. In the fresh morning light, the prints that lead away from the hotel run parallel like hands folded together. They move out toward the world, toward the houses with their curtains drawn, toward people making coffee and deciding whether to look out the window that day. They are the shape of what I broke and what I became. They are mine and not mine. The rules change after midnight. I learned that the hard way. I acted because I thought I could stop it. I ended by becoming what I feared.
If you find these pages and think you can do better, I believe you. But know this, some bargains are not spoken aloud, and some machines learn the face of the person who tries to stop them, and then they wear it.